The Star Wars galaxy was a vast and wondrous place, home to countless civilizations and the backdrop to one of the greatest stories ever told. Last year, for our 300,000 subscribers special, we did a rundown of the entire galaxy, providing a rough overview of everything within its confines. But what about what lay outside of the galaxy? Was there anything beyond its farthest frontier? Anything beyond the great starless void? Spoiler alert, yes there was. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at all of it.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Pretty much everything in Star Wars takes place in or comes from one single galaxy, usually referred to simply as the galaxy, or among fans, as the galaxy far, far away. This galaxy was about 120,000 light years in diameter and contained roughly 400 billion stars. Our own galaxy, for contrast, is estimated to be 150,000 to 200,000 light years in diameter, with anywhere between 1 to 400 billion stars. Almost every second of the Star Wars films takes place within the confines of this vast galactic disk. Almost. There are, in fact, a few exceptions to that rule. You may recall a certain scene from The Empire Strikes Back in which the Rebel fleet appears to be outside the galaxy, or you might recall from our video about the Kaminoans that Kamino was located outside of the galaxy entirely. Both of these examples, and most Star Wars stories that involve something outside of the galaxy, come from the galaxy satellites. The Star Wars galaxy had 7 satellite dwarf galaxies orbiting at varying ranges. The closest were Companion Orek and Companion Besh, popularly nicknamed the Rishi Maze and Firefist respectively. The others were companions Kresh, Dawn, Esk, Fawn, and Grek, which were farther than 150,000 light years away from the main galaxy and, as far as we know, were inaccessible for the galactic population. The dwarf satellites were considerably younger than the main galaxy, and between that and their small size, they were generally unfavorable for the development of sentient life. But we do know of a few sentient civilizations from the satellite galaxies, and we know that a few powerful companies, like the Intergalactic Banking Clan, established remote facilities in the nearer satellites as well. This would suggest that it was entirely possible that there were a good many civilizations in the dwarf satellites that we just don't know about, but they would probably be young and primitive. The Rishi Maze, the closest dwarf satellite galaxy, was perhaps the most well-known extragalactic object. Spacers could easily fly over to it from the main galaxy via the Zareka Sting, a hyperspace route that began at Rishi in the Outer Rim. Most of the Rishi Maze was uninhabited, used primarily by corporations and spacers for secret resource gathering operations. It was frequently used for illegal or seditious activity. The Rebel Alliance, for example, was known to have maintained several facilities in the Rishi Maze, including Firebase Alpha, an illegal energy mining station. There was also evidence that the Sith once had facilities in the Rishi Maze as well. It's quite possible that the scene at the end of The Empire Strikes Back takes place in the Rishi Maze, though it is unconfirmed. The extragalactic planet Kamino was located somewhere between the Rishi Maze and the main galaxy, fairly close to the Zareka Sting. It was part of a small cluster of stars that technically belonged to neither galaxy, which, contrary to what you might think, wasn't all that uncommon of a phenomenon. In fact, the Zareka Sting wove its way through a series of these isolated star clusters, which formed a sort of umbilical cord between the galaxy and the Rishi Maze, caught between their gravitational pulls. Firefist appears to have been the most stable of the satellite galaxies. Despite being the second closest of the satellites, it was still almost entirely unexplored by galactic civilization, visited only by a few probots before the Galactic Civil War. But it wasn't uninhabited. A grand total of 4 species are known to have been native to Firefist: the Nagai, the Toffs, the Macabre, and the Farun. These 4 species had fully developed civilizations, and while contact between them and the main galaxy was rare, it did happen. The giant, extraordinarily strong Toffs were the first of the species of Firefist to take to the stars. In the early days of their civilization, they were a seafaring people with a predilection for piracy. When they developed space travel, they adopted deliberately anachronistic styles, speech patterns, and even warship designs. Bands of Toffs went around pillaging every inhabited world they could find, defeating even the master shipbuilders of the Farun and the formidable Macabre cyborgs. They nearly met their match in the form of the warriors of the fearsome Nagai, but ultimately the Toffs proved victorious in that war too. Nagi, the homeworld of the Nagai, was subjugated and reduced to rubble, claimed as a monument of the Toffs' victory. But the Nagai refused to accept defeat, and allied with the Furun and Macabre. In the 300 years after Nagi's fall, they formed a resistance movement and began to fight back. The Toffs, however, proved much too powerful for simple rebels to overcome. The resistance quickly began to run out of resources. Desperate, the Nagai started to look toward the Sky River, as they called the Star Wars galaxy, for solutions to their problem. A few months after the Battle of Endor, the Nagai learned that the empire that ruled the Sky River had splintered, and the galaxy had become disorderly and unstable. They saw this as an opportunity. In 4 ABY, they launched an invasion of the Sky River, conquering several worlds and coming into conflict with the fledgling New Republic. However, their invasion was interrupted by the Toffs, who learned of their plans and were positively delighted to hear that there were millions of worlds waiting to be pillaged in the Sky River. They launched their own invasion, which prompted the New Republic to ally with the Nagai against them. The allied force defeated the Toffs, following which both the Nagai and their sworn enemies agreed to leave the Sky River. The New Republic did maintain relations with the Nagai, however, and they even gave them the planet Seijo, which the Nagai didn't really do anything with. The Nagai went back to trying to retake Nagi with the resources they had back in Firefist, having learned better strategies to use against the Toffs alongside the New Republic. Additionally, they didn't go back alone. They had apparently made friends with a band of Mandalorians during their invasion of the galaxy, and these Mandos went back with them to retake Nagi. They were ultimately successful. There was little extragalactic action beyond the Rishi Maze and Firefist, however, and for two simple reasons. The first was a series of hyperspace anomalies that ringed the galaxy, much like those that bordered the unknown regions. These made it very difficult to leave the galaxy altogether, though not impossible. The second was the intergalactic void. Now, you might think that voids made hyperspace travel easier. You could just cut straight across it without much hassle, right? Wrong. Even within the galaxy, traveling in large, stellar poor voids like the Radama Void and the Open Sea was considered suicidal. This is because hyperspace travel needed nearby stellar objects for navigational purposes. In voids, it was very easy for hyperspace navigation systems to cock up and get ships lost, effectively marooning. Hyperspace travel across regular voids was possible, but extremely risky. Hyperspace travel across the intergalactic void was all but impossible. We only know of one example of a ship from the main galaxy venturing into the intergalactic void. Luke Skywalker and Leia Organa ended up there once due to a hyperdrive malfunction and encountered an enigmatic biomechanical vessel simply known as Ship. Ship had fled another galaxy, which had been destroyed by war, seeking solace in the starless void. It was initially skeptical of the Skywalkers, but ultimately bonded with them, repaired their vessel and returned them safely to the galaxy, and blew up the Star Destroyer following them for good measure. It then returned to its wanderings. No one else from the main galaxy is known to have survived the intergalactic void, though the Starship Outbound flight had been on a mission to attempt exactly that when the Chiss shot it down a few years before the Clone Wars. Of course, there's also the elephant in the room here, the Yuuzhan'tar. As most of you surely know, the Yuuzhan'tar were a species from another galaxy entirely, which invaded the Star Wars galaxy in 25 ABY. The resultant 4-year war was one of the most calamitous in galactic history, resulting in hundreds of trillions of casualties. But that was nothing compared to what had happened in the Vong's own galaxy, far across the intergalactic void. That distant galaxy had once been home to a great many species, the Yuuzhan'tar among them. In the distant past, their galaxy had once been ruled over by two races of droids, the warlike Abominor and the refined Silentium. They waged a massive war that devastated much of the galaxy until one day, the meatbags got sick of their Sith and kicked them out. It's largely unknown where they went after that, except that one Abominor, the Great Heap, ended up on B2 in the Star Wars galaxy, and one Silentium, Vufi Ra, ended up being Lando Calrissian's traveling partner at one point. Additionally, there were still a fair few other Silentium left by the time of the Galactic Civil War, as Vufi Ra eventually left Lando to rejoin them. After the droids left, the inhabitants of the Vong galaxy largely eschewed traditional technology and shifted to organic alternatives. The Vong's biotech was extremely advanced, a gift from the Yuuzhan'tar, their homeworld, which was one living sentient organism. The Vong used this technology to conquer their entire galaxy. When there was no one left to fight, they turned on each other, ultimately resulting in the Kremlevian War, which they rendered their entire galaxy uninhabitable. That was 15,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. After this event, they left their galaxy in massive organic world ships which traveled the interstellar void at sublight speeds, slowly but surely creeping closer to the galaxy we all know and love. So that's what lay beyond the edges of the Star Wars galaxy, but what do you think? Would you like to see more about the Yuuzhan Vong, or perhaps the Nagai? Let us know all this and more in the comment section below. And just before you click on Generation Tech's How to Cook an Ewok Steak video, make sure you check out our GGN, our Geetsly's Gaming Network, which has just opened its Clone Wars role-playing server. Guys, this is a really great server, really great staff behind it as well, and you will have a lot of fun with it. So all the links and information for that is in the description. And if you want to check out our new channel called The Braved, which goes through all eras of history to find some of the most badass individuals from these eras, that link is also in the description below, as well as our Relax Jack music channel, where you can find the music we use here on most of our videos. That link is also in the description below. And if you want to join a behind the scenes Discord and get access to some exclusive posts, consider donating to our Patreon. And if you just want to join our wider community, join us on our Discord. All of these are in the description below. Anyways, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.